Could it be that the Prime Minister was reluctant to fire the member for Edmonton Centre for such things as breaking the Conflict of Interest Act and being a cultural appropriator, because by that standard, not only would the Prime Minister have to fire the member for Edmonton Centre, he'd also have to fire himself? Mr. Speaker, the member for Edmonton Centre has a lot to answer for. He has a lot to answer for, notwithstanding the fact that he recently resigned from Cabinet in disgrace. Among the serious matters that the member must answer for and be held accountable for is the fact that his shady pandemic profiteering PPE company falsely held itself out to be a wholly owned Indigenous company when it applied for 2 federal government contracts. It was a blatant attempt to give the company's bids a leg up in the government's procurement selection process. In other words, it was an attempt to steal contracts, government contracts, from legitimately owned Indigenous businesses. It's about as low as it gets. It's cultural appropriation in one of its most offensive forms. And you know what else it is, Mr. Speaker? It's fraud. It's outright fraud. And the Prime Minister knew about the fact that the minister's company had falsely represented itself in this way, and for days the Prime Minister stood behind the minister. He kept him in his cabinet. It was only when the Edmonton police officially announced that a criminal investigation had been launched into the member's company that he finally resigned from Cabinet. But I have to say, it isn't just that the Prime Minister, as bad as it was to stand behind the minister for days, the Prime Minister has stood behind the member for months, despite the fact that he faced a cloud of corruption that involved the fact that he almost certainly violated the Conflict of Interest Act while he was involved in the operations of the shady PPE company while he sat in Cabinet. That is a situation where the member broke the law, and text messages revealed that a Randy was involved in the operations, was in fact involved in a $500,000 shakedown, and no one can identify the other Randy other than the member for Edmonton Centre. And that didn't stop the Prime Minister from standing by the member for Edmonton Centre. Likewise, the member's company had been ordered by Alberta courts to pay back clients $8 million for ripping them off, and faces not less than 7 lawsuits alleging fraud. And that wasn't enough to kick him out of Cabinet, nor was the fact that the minister falsely held his company as being wholly Indigenous owned in applying for 2 government contracts. A normal Prime Minister, in fact any other Prime Minister, would have long said to the member for Edmonton Centre, "You're fired, you're out of Cabinet."
Exactly right.
But this is not a normal Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who has presided over a culture of corruption and conflict that goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister himself. And I have to ask, was the Prime Minister's reluctance to fire the member for Edmonton Centre related to the fact that this is a Prime Minister who has been found guilty not once but twice of none other than breaking the Conflict of Interest Act? Could the Prime Minister's reluctance also have had something to do with the fact that he is, like the member for Edmonton Centre, a cultural appropriator? Now, this is a Prime Minister who has worn blackface more times than he can recall. This is a Prime Minister who has repeatedly worn highly inappropriate and culturally insensitive costumes, including while serving as Prime Minister. Could it be that the Prime Minister was reluctant to fire the member for Edmonton Centre for such things as breaking the Conflict of Interest Act and being a cultural appropriator, because by that standard, not only would the Prime Minister have to fire the member for Edmonton Centre, he'd also have to fire himself? I would submit that a strong inference in the affirmative can be drawn in that regard. And with respect to the member for Edmonton Centre and the fact that his company falsely represented itself as being wholly Indigenous owned, the member's excuse is that he had no idea, that it was all the fault of his business partner, Anderson. Well, let me observe that the member for Edmonton Centre has repeatedly and disturbingly held himself out to be Indigenous. This is a member who once said that he was Métis, then he said he was non-status adopted Cree, then he said he wasn't Indigenous at all but an ally of Indigenous peoples, and now I believe he is purporting again to be Métis. Maybe he's not. It's tough to keep track given all of the representations over the years that the member for Edmonton Centre has made about his Indigenous status, which in fact he doesn't have. And I have to also observe that I've listened to that member make those representations. I can remember when he sat over there between 2015 and 2019, and I heard him make those types of representations enough times that I simply assumed that one aspect of his background was that he had an Indigenous ancestry of some sort. Now, so for the member to say that he had no idea doesn't bear any credibility. I would submit that it's part of a pattern. This is a member who constantly says, very conveniently, he has no idea. He has no idea that his company falsely represented itself to be Indigenous owned, just as the member had no idea that his company was connected to a cocaine trafficker, just as the member said he had no idea about the text messages from Randy to his business partner implicated in a $500,000 fraud, just as the member says he has no idea about the arson at the company's warehouse. Mr. Speaker, on and on it goes. The minister's contention that he had no idea about the fact that his company tried to steal government contracts from legitimately owned Indigenous businesses has zero credibility. I would further observe that the minister, at the time that these bids were made and these false representations were made, the minister wasn't just anyone at the company. He was one of two partners at the company, and he was involved in the operations of the company on a day-to-day basis. This was, after all, before the member returned and was appointed to cabinet after the 2021 election. And as I noted, it seems very likely that, notwithstanding that he must not have, the member continued to be involved in the operations of the business, including potentially involving himself in matters of fraud while he sat in cabinet. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the minister come before committee to answer questions. The day that the minister resigned from cabinet happened to be the very day that he was scheduled to appear before the Ethics Committee. I have to say that I find it highly suspicious that the member resigned from cabinet on that very day. Mr. Speaker, the member, I also have to say, has been less than transparent when he has come before a committee. When he first appeared before committee, when allegations surrounding these text messages of a Randy, he claimed, and he had committee believe, that he had nothing to do with the company, nothing to do with the operations, nothing to do with communicating with Anderson, until further text messages revealed that this Randy was in Vancouver at the very same time that the minister was in Vancouver. And then he came back to committee and said, oh, actually, I did talk to my business partner, Anderson. Oops, I forgot to mention it. Mr. Speaker, that isn't just an omission, it is a material omission that amounts to misleading the committee.
Exactly right.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Edmonton Centre had better not hide behind the fact that he isn't in cabinet, because right now he is in hiding. No one has heard or seen from the member since he resigned from cabinet. He needs to come out of hiding. He needs to come to committee, and he must answer for his conduct involving this sordid and fraudulent matter. Thank you.